This is the Ancient and Medieval History Lecture for Thursday, 4th of November, 2021. We have been talking about Old Kingdom Egypt, and one of the classic things that pretty much everyone knows about Egypt is about the mummies, mummification. The belief that leads to mummies is a belief that the human soul has many parts. One of those parts is called the Ka. The Ka lives on after death near where the body is buried. The mummification process, which involves taking out the organs, they didn't know what the brain was for, they just threw it away. But they put the important organs, like your heart and your lungs and your kidneys, in canopic jars. And once they had taken out your innards, they would use natron and a bunch of other chemicals to desiccate you, to strip you of your water. And then they'd wrap you in the mummy wrappings. This process would preserve your body because they don't have much water, any water if the process works. Mummies are very, very light and highly flammable. Mummies are buried with objects outside of the coffin for the dead Ka, or the part of the soul that is the Ka, to use. So a pharaoh who is buried in a chamber, like Tutankhamun of the New Kingdom, or like Cheops or Khufu of the Old Kingdom, is going to have an entire apartment worth of furniture, some food, almost like the Neanderthals and early Cro-Magnons used to bury for people who were going to the happy hunting ground. But this is so that the Ka would be comfortable in its part of the afterlife. Now, obviously, pharaohs were buried with great care. Being gods as well as men, you don't want to offend the gods by making a hash of it. But everyday people were mummified in Egypt during these times. And, of course, cats, to honor the cat's service in protecting the crops, and to honor the cat goddess Bast, who was the patron of all felines. In the Old Kingdom, they constructed pyramids as artificial mountains upon which another part of the pharaoh, not his Ka, would ascend to the heavens. Open are the double doors of the horizon. Unlocked are its vaults. So the spirit of the old pharaoh, a god, goes to join the other gods in the heavens. And the new pharaoh takes on a godly aspect. Now, pyramids sound easy to build in the sense that it's a fairly simple plan. But it's not. First of all, pyramids are not solid. Pyramids have hidden tombs within. Hallways, ramps, false tombs to lure tomb robbers, traps, including acid traps, pit traps, spring traps, rock traps, all kinds of traps. Maybe a couple of false chambers. And then hidden the real chamber of the pharaoh's actual mummified body, where his Ka would live. And the idea was that by doing this, the pharaoh's Ka would be preserved his treasure would be available to the Ka, and pyramids would be effective. Were they effective at sending the pharaoh's soul to the heavens? Ask one. I don't know. But religiously, it would serve the purpose, I would think. But when Pharaoh is looted, as grave robbers inevitably and universally enter the pyramids, find the false tombs, defeat the traps, either by having some poor schmo walk up as your cannon fodder. Okay, I'll lead the way. Sure, I'll carry the torch. Oh-be-doop-be-doop. Well, guess that trap is sprung. Now it's your turn. I don't want to go. Go! So, one way or another, the tomb robbers would defeat the traps, work their way through the false chambers, and find the real chamber. Without exception, every pyramid failed within a couple of generations of when the pharaohs were actually buried. Now, one way to deal with this problem is to recognize that when you build secret tombs, you don't have android workers. You have human workers. How do you deal with the fact that a few years after the pharaoh dies, or even a few months after the pharaoh dies, whenever they stop posting a lot of guards, you can use your knowledge, because you helped build the traps, to defeat them. And to get into the tomb with a bunch of buddies, so that pharaonic pyramidical tomb that you helped build as a young man and sealed away is now going to become a source of wealth in your middle age as you lead or abet the arrival of tomb robbers. So, what some pharaohs did, what some people did, is when the workers were done. Sorry, being too much like the president. Is when the workers were done, kill them. As they said in Treasure Island, dead men tell no tales. So, do you want to be a pharaoh's worker? Do you want to work on the pyramids? They got beer, and they did. They used a combination of beer for the skilled workforce and whips for the unskilled workforce. Piling stone upon stone upon stone, building the secret tombs. Now, one of the earliest pyramids is the pyramid of the architect Imhotep at Saqqara. And it is famously known as the Step Pyramid because it is built as a series of ascending steps. This is not to scale. You know, and that conveys the general idea. And by the way, since Imhotep is the name of the mummy in a number of mummy movies, I thought I would mention who he really was. He was the architect of the Step Pyramid at Saqqara. You get the idea. Although the world is obviously angled because why not? Like a Batman villain. Is that good enough? Is the Step Pyramid, which is among the earliest, is that really going to be good enough for a living God? No, that doesn't have to be angled. It doesn't. Because this line here is roughly true. So, if I make the horizon roughly parallel to that, It's only slightly angled. And there is no group of mountains in the distance because it's Egypt. No mountains. It's a little better. So, at Dahshur, Sneferu, Pharaoh Sneferu, has a much more ambitious pyramid plan. Yep. He's going to build a real pyramid, a true pyramid. And it's going to be tall. It's going to be great. It's going to have everything you could want, except they realized partway through that it was too steep and that the stone would fail. And every time they tried building up beyond a certain point, it would collapse. So, what they did was they changed the angle. And suddenly, you have this bent pyramid. I don't know if you can see it, but from the side, it looks a bit like that. It's badly done. It doesn't quite look like a ziggurat. First of all, it's much larger than a ziggurat. Pyramids are entirely larger than ziggurats. But still, you can see that they tried to do something that they didn't quite pull off. The bent pyramid is a case study in being too ambitious for your own good. Did you ever, at the beginning of a semester, plan out your study schedule? I did. And I never kept to it, because it was a stupid plan. Because I thought that I would be oh so disciplined and I would use every minute of every hour of every day that I was awake and had free time to study my Spanish and my math and my science, which were problems for me. And I spent hours on the study schedule. Hours. Even used colors to help designate different topics for different times. And then I put it on a shelf and found it the next year when I was going to do a new study schedule. Don't do that. Don't waste your time with an intricate study schedule. It never works. Unless you're a completely different psychology than me. Then who knows? It might work. But I think people who are actually good at being students, which I wasn't when I was your age, don't need to write out a big study schedule with, colors and different symbols. I think you just do it. So, Pharaoh Sneferu's step pyramid was an exercise in an overly ambitious plan that couldn't be executed. Kind of embarrassing. Well, Khufu, who the Greeks called Cheops, where I got Cheops. Khufu is going to do something different. He's not going to screw up. He's going to invest in the best architects, the best stonemasons, the best rock quarries. He's going to make sure that his pyramid is the grandest of them all. So, at the plateau of Giza, outside of the floodplain, God, I'm tired. Outside of the floodplain of the Nile River, Khufu will build his great complex of pyramids, including the Great Pyramid at Giza. All of these still exist, by the way. And a bunch of pyramids, little steppy pyramids, for his wives. Because if you're a pharaoh, you've got wives to take care of, not only in this life, but in the next. And I'm not going to waste too much time on these. They're smaller, much smaller. I think there are 3 of them. Stop that. Pen has a mind of its own. No, I'm just not drawing particularly well today. And of course, you know that at Giza there's another big pyramid, not quite as big. I think it was built by his son. Still pretty darn big. There, I think there's some wifely pyramids for him as well. So, there we go. We'll make them two. No, that stinks. That's terrible. I can't do that. Yeah, there we go. Okay. I'm sure these are oriented wrong. They're probably parallel to these. But I'm not an expert on the pyramids. The Great Pyramid of Pharaoh Khufu, what the Greeks knew as Cheops, was the tallest building on Earth until they built the Eiffel Tower in the late 1800s. And unlike the Eiffel Tower, which is made of wrought iron and steel in this open latticework frame, very delicate, very thin, this thing is a giant mound of rock. Now, did the pyramids then look like the pyramids now? I hope not. Because now they look like they're, 3,000, 4,000 years old? They're old. You know, you can see that when you get close, that what looks like a smooth line turns out to be a bunch of rocks. You can climb the pyramids. Tourists used to. I don't know if they're still allowed to, or the Egyptian government stops people. God forbid some terrorist comes along and put a bomb, and then it will not be a pyramid, and they'll remember my cause. No, jerk. I don't know. If you go to Egypt today, if you can still climb the pyramids. But what they used to be covered with was a layer of smooth marble. So from a distance, the pyramids would be this pure white, and they'd have a gold capstone. Well, it wouldn't be stone because it's gold, but they'd have a gold covering over the capstone. So the pyramids wouldn't be this sort of sandy stone, gray, rough things at close range. No, they'd be these perfect marble slabs with a gold capstone on top. I mean, really beautiful things. Even if they didn't keep the pharaoh's ka happy, because their grave robbers always got in. Now, the pyramid complex at Giza is oriented to the constellation Orion and a bunch of other astronomical things. Like other megaliths, they serve a bunch of purposes. But after the time of Cheops and his immediate family, because people aren't stupid, they do come to understand that pyramids don't work at protecting the pharaoh's ka or mummy. It's not so much that grave robbers want to mess with the ka or steal the mummy. That is the point. They want the gold. They want the jewels. They want the gemstones. They want the money. And they're going to get it one way or another. So after this period, pharaohs stopped building these grandiose tombs and start building hidden tombs. So that well over 1,000 years later, in New Kingdom Egypt, you have a place called the Valley of Kings, which is this canyon-type valley, rocky and filled with, little crenellations and stones. And it's an unpleasant place to be, and it's far enough away from the lands of the living to count as a necropolis. A necropolis is like a metropolis except for dead people. Metropolis for the living, necropolis for the dead. The Valley of the Kings is this sort of hidden necropolis for pharaohs. And when the French and later the British took over Egypt, they were fascinated by the prospect of the mummies and the tombs and the ancient wealth, just like everyone else who's been to Egypt would be. So they sent archaeological expeditions into the Valley of Kings to find tombs. They weren't easy to find because they were hidden. And because by the time we have the Valley of Kings, it was pretty clear that the workers who designed them were going to be killed so they were condemned men. And they were given something to work well. Maybe their families were taken care of. I don't know. But the secrets of the Valley of Kings were supposed to be kept better. But again, and again, and again, as the archaeologists opened up these tombs, they found that they had been ransacked. It seemed like there was no chance of finding actual pharaonic tomb intact until 1923. Howard Carter, British archaeologist, leads an expedition into the Valley of Kings, where, through many trials and tribulations, he discovers the son of the first monotheist pharaoh, who was Akhenaten. His son, who took the throne at 14, Tutankhamun, his tomb was found. And it was found intact. All the treasure, the mummy, everything. Now, there was a rumor that this was cursed, that one of the traps was a curse, that whoever so opened the tomb, they would die. And wouldn't you know it, within the next dozen years, pretty much everyone who had been a part of opening that tomb was dead. Some of them had been old. And in the 1920s and early 30s, medical technology didn't have a lot of the cures that we have today. And there are accidents and there are other things. But still, beware the curse! Because people actually did believe, and this is something that was in newspapers and books and, again, subjects of movies, that there was, in fact, a real curse, and that Howard Carter and his companions were all killed by it. Who knows? In any event, I got to see King Tut stuff in 1977 or 78. It was on a world tour, and it toured the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And I was living in the Connecticut suburbs at that point, which wasn't that far away. So our school did a field trip down to the Met when I was in like 5th or 6th or 7th grade, and it was great. I will call on you. His sarcophagus had this beautiful face. There were statues of him. There was this famous sort of dog-legged couch that his cock could sit on. Yes.
Wasn't it that like there was like a new type of there's a type of bacteria inside of the tomb or something like that?
That is said. Yes. Yeah. And who knows? Probably true.
Yeah.
So maybe the mummy's curse was that you suddenly encounter a bacteria that hasn't been around for thousands of years, and you've got no immunity to it.
Yeah.
So, any questions on the mummies, or the pyramids, or the tombs before we go deeper in? Yeah.
Where does the Sphinx come into all of it?
The Sphinx is a later production. The pyramids were already ancient. I believe they exist from the time of Rameses II, who's a New Kingdom pharaoh.
Oh.
He was a very powerful guy, and some people say, I don't necessarily agree, but a lot of people say that Rameses II was the pharaoh of the Exodus, the one who wouldn't let the people go. And for reasons that are unclear, but I'm sure have to do with Egyptian religion at the time, and politics, they built a giant lion statue with Ramesses' face on it. And it's one of literally hundreds of statues that they made of Ramesses. He has one of the most famous faces in the ancient world. Now, what has happened since is that the Sphinx was a more complex structure than the pyramids. You've got a human face there on a lion's body. So the face has partially disintegrated, partially fallen off. Now, between the front paws of the Sphinx, I think, was a tomb or some kind of underground chamber. But it's not like the pyramids. It wasn't intended, I don't think, to be any kind of pharaonic tomb. It was a monument and it had its secrets. But I don't think it was a tomb. Do any of you know more about the mummies or the Sphinx than I have said? I'm not an Egyptologist.
Did the so-called mythologies of the Sphinx come around because of the statue with his face?
I think so. Yes, Sphinx are especially female Sphinx. There are myths of gynosphinxes, which are female sphinxes, and they are supposed to love riddles. They love asking people riddles, and if people don't solve the riddles, they eat them, and if people do solve the riddles, they help them. But I tend to think that that's a lot of stuff that was invented after the fact. But I don't know. Yeah.
I used to really enjoy those books that were the big books that had information on different topics. Like
Yep.
there was the Dragonology and the Egyptology
Oh, yeah.
one.
Mhm.
I own those two, and another one that wasn't of the same series but
Mhm.
similar. And in this Egyptology book, there's like an old Egyptian game, and then there's riddles, and I don't know. I think it was really cool.
So it combines a number of the old Egyptian ideas. The fact that it has riddles is amazingly cool.
It has like a whole book of different riddles, and it has an Egyptian game, and it has a piece of mummy's cloth. I don't know if it's real.
Oh,
Probably
it
not.
doesn't matter. It's wonderful. And when you're a kid, no, that's incredible stuff. I had stuff like that with dinosaurs, and later with Romans and stuff. That's good stuff. I was introduced to riddles with The Hobbit, the book The Hobbit, and the riddle game with Gollum and Bilbo underground. If I had known, I would have invited you to bring the book in, if you still have it.
I still do have it. I could...
Maybe next week. I won't be here tomorrow, but maybe next Monday or so. That would be fantastic. Take a look. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. The Old Kingdom falls. Everything ends. And there is a period of brief barbarism, and then the Middle Kingdom arises. The Middle Kingdom, to me, stands out not because of pyramids, because it doesn't build any, not because of the famous pharaohs, because those are mostly New Kingdom. But the pharaoh's government wants to shore up its support among the people so it doesn't fall like the Old Kingdom did. So the government sets up the world's first welfare program so that workers are taken care of if they're injured, and farmers who are out of work are given work to do by the pharaohs. I mean, a lot of that had happened in the Old Kingdom anyway. But there's a promise, there's an assurance by the government that you will be taken care of that is very similar to modern welfare programs. So that's what I would have you know about the Middle Kingdom. Oh, and they were conquered by the Hyksos, which were people out of the desert that were good with chariots and horsemen, and they bring down the Middle Kingdom. The New Kingdom arises after an intermediate period of barbarism brought on by the Hyksos conquest. And the New Kingdom, no pyramids, still lots of mummies, but it has a number of famous pharaohs. For example, Hatshepsut. I say that badly. Hatshepsut, and I'm sure she's mentioned in the book, is the only female pharaoh we have on record. But she was a transvestite. She had to be, because you couldn't have a female pharaoh. So she wore this fake beard. It was like a strap-on beard. She'd put it on like you put on an eye patch. And so you'd have this female pharaoh walking around with a beard and dressed like a man and acting. But she was a pretty good pharaoh. She actually ran things pretty smoothly. And then there was Thutmose, who was a conquering pharaoh, warrior. But to me, one of the most interesting stories of the pharaohs of the New Kingdom is the story of Pharaoh Akhenaten. Akhenaten, who's in your notes, comes to power in the normal fashion. He is dedicated to Ammunara, the god of the sun of traditional Egypt, and all the other gods, and he becomes a god king. And it seems like a fairly normal situation. Except Akhenaten has his own ideas. He doesn't believe in the old gods of Egypt. He believes in a new god, represented by the sun, but not Amun-Ra. The Aten. The Aten, or the Aten, is the one true only god whose primary representation is the sun. Now, the belief in one God was not common in the ancient world. The Hebrews had it. That's about it. And it's an open question whether Akhenaten got the idea from the Hebrews, who were in Egypt at the time. In the art of the Akhenaten period, the sun is pictured as a disk with sun rays coming out and little hands on the tips of the sun rays. And what this represents is a hand with thumbs that is the power of God to intervene in daily life. So what Akhenaten tries to do is convert Egypt to the belief in the Aten, which is an interesting thing, because the pharaoh's power comes from the traditional religion of Egypt, from the old gods. And now we have a guy who, according to the old religion, is one of the old gods, who is saying, those don't exist. Follow me and this new God of the sun. One God to rule them all. One God to find them. So, what do? The only reason you're obeying this guy is because he's supposed to be a god in the old religion. But he's saying the old religion doesn't exist. Think about that. Do you listen to him? And if you listen to him, why? Because if the old religion doesn't exist, who is he? Except just another guy. This creates problems. Akhenaten neglects the military, and so the outer edges of the Egyptian empire get conquered by enemies. Akhenaten closes down the old temples and forces new temples to be built to the Aten. He builds a new capital city, not Memphis, not Thebes, who were both traditional capital cities of Egypt. No, this is Asmara. And so Akhenaten takes away from the people the very gods and worship that are at the heart of Egyptian civilization, in order to get them to be monotheistic sun worshippers. His reign ends in riots, in burned cities, in foreign invasions. His son, Tutankhamun, starts out after his dead daddy worshiping the Aten. But within a few months, he has been renamed Tutankhamun, who is the King Tut of the tomb. And the priests have reopened the old temples, have closed down the new temples, have abandoned the city of Asmara, and it's back to normal Egyptian life. King Tut doesn't live to see much of it. He dies young. But the traditional religion is back in charge. What lessons can we draw from this? Number one, if you are standing on a cliff and you say, I don't believe in cliffs, you might suddenly be in a Looney Tunes cartoon. The cliff may disappear and suddenly you're falling. It's like Wile E. Coyote when he runs off a cliff and he's still running and he doesn't know he's gone off the cliff, so he's not falling yet. And then there's that terrible moment when he realizes, uh-oh, and he looks down. And only when he looks down does he start to fall. If your basis of power is the old religion, denying the old religion and trying to destroy it might be a problem. Because the people who would follow you because of the old religion now have no reason to follow you, number one. Number two, can a government official, even a god king of Egypt, reach into your heart and soul and mind and compel you to believe in a different God than you naturally actually believe in? Does the government have the power to reprogram its citizens against their will to conform with the leader's wishes? Quickly, Akhenaten discovers that everyone around him is going to say precisely what he wants, because the army and the priests and all the rest. But as he destroys the old religion, he has fewer and fewer people that come to him. More and more people have been cast out because they don't believe. And when he's not there, when he's not around, what's going to happen? Can he make sure that nobody secretly prays to the old gods? Can he make sure that the abandoned temples are no longer going to be visited? Sneakily? I don't know if that's a word, but I'm going to use it. Sneakily? At night? Does the government have that kind of power? God, I hope not. 3. I look at Akhenaten as a cautionary tale. A lot of Christians wonder if God, and a lot of people who question Christianity, wonder if God was to come to the world, why did he pick a backwater province in the Roman Empire? And why did he pick some obscure carpenter's son? Why not come in as a king? Why not come in as a Roman emperor? Well, maybe Akhenaten is a cautionary tale about that. Jesus of Nazareth had nothing in his background that was going to help him be a religious leader or a teacher or a Messiah. So the people who followed him because of who he was and what he did and what he said, because they actually believed. No one followed Jesus because they were told to by their boss or by their lord or by the government. People followed Jesus out of conviction because he had nothing to offer them but take up a cross yourself. Is it possible that Akhenaten and his failure is why the great prophets are rarely powerful royal people? I mean, the Buddha comes from a princely family in India, but he gave that up before becoming the Buddha. He didn't use his family wealth to spread his word. Zoroaster was a nobody until he started preaching. Moses, there's a story about him being raised as a prince of Egypt, but he wasn't a prince of Egypt. And Moses could only do so much. Who was Abraham? He was a shepherd on the edge of the world in ancient Sumer. So the idea of God taking a human leader like a pharaoh and using him to spread the word has some big problems. Not the least of which is religious belief and political allegiance are different things. If you believe in your country, you're motivated by patriotism. That's fine. But that isn't the same thing as believing in the creator of the universe, the source of good and evil, right and wrong, where your soul's going to go. Government and religion are different. Even in Egypt, they are different. And to have the leader of government tell an entire nation of people, don't worship the way you've always worshipped throughout the last 1,000+ years. Worship in a new way, in my new way. It's probably not going to end well. Trust me. There were crowds in ancient Egypt at the time of Pharaoh Akhenaten who said their version, chanted their version of Let's Go Brandon. Because they couldn't say what they wanted to say without getting punished. But they were not happy. And that non-happiness showed. Now we move ahead. Pharaoh Rameses II. He reigns for about 70+ years. I mean, a ridiculously long reign. He dies a very, very old man. And he's a successful pharaoh in many ways. Rameses is famous for fighting the Battle of Kadesh on the Syrian border. Was Rameses the god, the pharaoh of the Exodus? In the movie The Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston, made back in the 50s, he is played masterfully by an actor named Yul Brynner, who was a Hungarian. Bald. And he was this villainous presence on screen, and he was Moses' foil, and it was a good character. But the thing about Rameses that history remembers is that, with a few exceptions, his reign was largely successful. Would the loss of the Hebrew slaves and all of the various plagues that God sent down to Egypt be consistent with a largely successful reign like Rameses? I don't think so. So it may have been one of Rameses' children. It was somewhere around 12, 13, or 1400 BC. But we don't know who the Pharaoh of the Exodus was. We just know that at some point, Hebrews who had come into Egypt to avoid famine ended up leaving Egypt under a cloud. Near the end of the New Kingdom, the Egyptian coastline is threatened by a new invader called the Sea Peoples. The Sea Peoples, they don't get there by land. The Sea Peoples were a scourge to the coastline of the eastern Mediterranean, and they landed in Israel as the Philistines. And I've already told you about the story of David and Goliath, and of Samson and Delilah, and the Philistines fighting against the kingdom of the Jews, of the Hebrews. Well, Egypt was hit hard by the Sea Peoples as well, and they were weakened by attacks from the seas up the Nile River, from the sea up the Nile River. Ultimately, Egypt is conquered in the 6th century before Christ, in the 500s BC, by the Persian Empire. The second great king of the Persian Empire, the Achaemenid Empire, a guy named Cambyses, goes to Egypt, conquers the place, slays the Apis bull, which is a religious thing, proving his legitimacy. And so New Kingdom Egypt is now part of the Persian Empire, and the history of Egypt will be the history of Persia, and then Alexander the Great's empire, and then the Roman Empire, and then the Byzantine Empire, and then the Arab Empire, and so forth. Any other questions or thoughts on Egypt? It's a fairly quick study because we've spent so much time on other things. Okay. I've talked to you about megaliths already, big stone constructions that are designed to show the solar calendar. I haven't told you about Ogham stones yet. Ogham stones are from Northern Europe, from the people that produce, probably from the people that produce Stonehenge. An Ogham stone is a vertical stone that tends to have lines on it that are carved in at various lengths and with various frequencies. And they mean something. They're usually placed at crossroads and other propitious places. Ogham stones were considered to be holy by the Celts, who ended up taking over the areas that have the Ogham stones. They're not very large, but we don't know exactly what purpose they served. They weren't like Stonehenge in that they weren't astronomical. Could they commemorate graves? Could they commemorate the power of magic, of ley lines at a crossroads, which is a Celtic belief that the earth has a blood system like we do, and that the blood veins and vessels are called ley lines, and they're sort of magical highways? I don't know, but they're there. So megaliths include Ogham stones, they include Stonehenge, they include the pyramids, they include the ziggurats, all sorts of things like that. Okay. Yes?
What's the difference between the lunar calendar and the solar calendar?
Well, the lunar calendar is every time you have a new moon, you start a new month. But the lunar calendar, I don't remember the exact length of time, but the lunar calendar has in it a set of months that are different. And the word month comes from moon in English. It has a different length than the solar calendar. So I think it's 12 and a half or 13 lunar months to a solar year. I think it's closer to 12 and a half. So what happens is, do any of you know? Okay. What happens is that if you just use the moons, soon you're going to have your months completely dislocated from the seasons that they're supposed to be in. And so you have, in July, ice storms and snow, and in January you've got hot, sweltering weather. Because if you follow strict lunar calendars, it really doesn't match up. After fairly, just a few decades, your seasons are off. The solar calendar is how long it takes the Earth to travel around the sun in one revolution. Now, of course, the ancients didn't think of it that way. The ancients thought of the solar year as the sun starts out low in the heavens, that's winter. And then it gets higher in the heavens as it's going overhead, and that's spring and summer. And then it gets lower in the heavens again, and that's fall and down to winter again. So they don't match up. Obviously, our seasons are based on the solar calendar. And one of the reasons why you need megaliths is because figuring out the solar calendar without measuring things in the heavens is difficult. Make sense? Okay. Babylon. Ancient Babylon has two great eras. The earliest of the two is the age of King Hammurabi, the first Babylonian empire. Close to 4,000 years ago, 35 to 4,000 to 4,000 years ago, somewhere closer between 1500 and 2000 BC. You've got the time of Hammurabi in Babylon. Obviously, that is where Hammurabi's code comes from. But what you need to understand is that Babylon, for its time, is considered to be the center of the world. So, here's Babylon, roughly. Everyone who's going to Persia goes through Babylon. Everyone who's going to Syria goes through Babylon. Everyone who's going up into Anatolia, what's now Turkey, goes through Babylon. Anyone who's going south to the Persian Gulf goes through Babylon. Babylon is going to rule over this Mesopotamian region. If you're going from Sumer to Akkad or back again, you go through Babylon. Babylon is called the Crossroads of the world. It is considered to be the center of the world. And what's interesting is the Arabs, a couple of thousand years later, say the same thing about Baghdad, which is built fairly close to Babylon. When the Persians rule it, they use a place called Ctesiphon, which is fairly close to Babylon. So Babylon being at the heart of Mesopotamia, not north, not south, but central, between Persia and Syria, is at a crossroads of world trade and world travel, and everyone who's going through that part of the world is going to see the great city. And Babylon has a reputation, a lot like New York City or London, as being these super cosmopolitan places. Because in Babylon, because it's a crossroads of the world city, you can go to Babylon and you can see people from India, and you can see people from Celtic Europe, and you can see people from Egypt, and you can see people from the Asian steppes. You can see people from all over the known world, and maybe even beyond the known world. So everyone who's anyone is going to go through Babylon. And I think that's where I'm going to leave things today. Now, tomorrow, I'm not going to be here. Instead of planning a video, I'm going to give you the day to work. You have upcoming case studies. In this room are encyclopedias, which are not to leave this room, but which you can use here. In this room are textbooks. There are a few extra textbooks of Spielvogel over there, And over here, there are a bunch of other world history textbooks that you can use. There are also other books. So, since the 50 fact sheet is coming up soon, I strongly recommend that you use the resources in this classroom to get that done or mostly done. Questions, comments, thoughts? Okay, and I want to hear good things from the sub. Yes?
So when you said maybe even beyond the Known World, were there people who came from?
Possibly from China. Yeah. There were people who traveled across the early Silk Road from China over to the Middle East, and I think it's very likely that you'd have a few people from that far away.
Yeah.
Heck, you might have people from Britain there, too.
Yeah, so if like that were to happen, people would have no idea
Right.
who they were, right?
Yeah, so the people who are traveling would have to learn the local languages.
Yeah.
But yeah, and there's something exotic about that.
Yeah.
I mean, if you go to New York City or even Los Angeles, although it's not quite the same, you can encounter people from countries that you probably never heard of.
Yeah.
You have more? I didn't want to interrupt.
Yeah, I was just wondering about that because like in China, like it's just mountainous areas, and they like for centuries just didn't really have very much interaction with other
They wouldn't be
civilizations.
Yeah, they wouldn't be government people.
Yeah.
They'd be people involved in trade. They'd be people who were exploring and seeing the world.
Yeah.
No, the Chinese Empire had little to do with anything beyond the northern fringe of the Himalayan mountains.
Yeah.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Take care.